I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. With 4 weeks to go until the Voice Referendum, the Yes campaign is facing an enormous task to build momentum and turn the polls around. It's rolled out a new ad, while thousands are marching for Yes across the country this weekend. But we've just seen one of the most bruising weeks in the debate as Parliament sat for the final time before next month's vote. Across the dispatch box, there was the usual back and forth over the merits of enshrining an Indigenous body in the Constitution, but that wasn't the focus. Much deeper questions of racism and the reasons for Indigenous disadvantage took this campaign into more difficult territory. In a moment, the panel, Bridget Brennan, James Massola and Clare Armstrong. First, to my interview with leading No Campaigner Warren Mundine. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, David.
So let's start with this. Are there, in your view, ongoing negative impacts of colonisation?
Sorry, I've lost you.
Okay, well, just try and fix that up. Can you hear me there now?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Just asking, do you agree there are no ongoing negative impacts of colonisation? What's your view on this?
Well, you look at the history of humanity, it's just about every race, every religious group, every country in the world has been colonised, has been invaded, has been attacked. And what you see, you even look at England, for instance, we call them Anglo-Saxons. Why do we call them Anglo-Saxons? Because that's two Germanic tribes who invaded and took over the country. The question isn't about the ongoing trauma or anything like that. What the question is, how do we move forward? You cannot go on forever saying that colonisation, because it's just fact, it's happened, is going to stop us from doing things, is going to stop us from improving our lives and keep us in poverty. That is, if that's a statement, then I think we're heading up the wrong track.
Okay, but to move forward, you need to identify if there's a problem and what's causing it. You yourself have said in the past, Warren Mundine, too many Indigenous people continue to live in poverty and suffer the consequences. This stems from past maltreatment and discrimination.
Of course that is. That's just a fact. We've got to recognise the problems of the past. We've got to talk about our history factually and actually do things. But at the same time, we have to move forward. If we do not move forward, then we're stuck in history. We've got to move and improve our lives and get things done. And if we don't do that, then we're just in a trap, a cycle, a Groundhog Day.
But is the disadvantage that's there right now that needs to be dealt with, is it in part due to those ongoing impacts of colonisation?
Well, if that was the truth, then how come people like myself, how come Marcia Langton, how come Noel Pearson, how come these people have been very successful and have done great things? Like all those doctors we have now. When I was a kid, we didn't even know about doctors.
Plenty haven't though, Warren, and then you know that.
No, I'm not arguing that. I don't think you heard what I said. I said we need to face the facts. And we need to do things. The problem with the Voice campaign, and this is one of the lies of the Voice campaign, is that Aboriginal people do not have a voice. In actual fact, we do.
We'll come to that. But aren't the facts clear in the Close the Gap figures? Aren't they very clear that there is a gap there across employment, health, education, incarceration outcomes?
In some communities it is. There was a Centre for Independent Studies had a study where the biggest gap is not between black and white, but the biggest gap is between Aboriginals in cities and large provincial towns and people living in regional and remote Australia. These are where the problems are. We've got to stop treating all Aboriginals the same. We need to be focusing on the ones who are struggling and who are in need of support.
Just on this point of colonisation though, January 26 marks the day the colony began. You've argued many times, Warren Mundine, that we need to change the date of Australia Day. You've said it's a day of invasion, a disastrous defining moment for Indigenous people, that it represents conflict and conquest. Is January 26 a symbol of that negative impact of colonisation?
Only if we let it be. January 26th is always going to be an important day because of the fact that Europeans come to Australia and set up the colonies here. We can't get away from that, but we can't become captive of it. We've got to face the facts that we've got to move on from that. Yes, recognise that history, yes, recognise that invasion, recognise the good and the bad that's in our history, but we still got to move on.
Do you still want to change the date?
Yeah, I'm a change the date person,
Why?
but I come up with a bad idea. I said the 1st of January is the foundation date of our nation in 1901. But being a good Aussie, I like my public holidays. I don't want to lose
Fair
one.
enough.
But the problem
why do you want to change the date?
The problem because we're going through this parental, annual argument, which is not helping us. We're just arguing about this. And this is one of the reasons why I believe that the idea that the Voice, when it's set up, isn't going to talk about Australia Day is nonsense. We need to confront it and talk about it, and we need to have a mature debate. The problem we have is that when we try and pick a date, like I did, it runs into problems. And so, we've got to really work on it.
But you can see the contradiction here. The No campaign's hopping into the idea of the Voice saying they'll want to change the date. You're one of the leading No campaigners. You want to change the date.
Yeah, that's correct, and I've always stand strong in this. One of the things about this debate, I've always been honest, even though I know people on my side don't agree with me on these two issues, and that's treaties, and that's the change.
So
you
support treaties. Why?
I say treaties in the plural sense because we've got to recognise Aboriginal culture. Aboriginal culture is our First Nations, and so and the first thing we learn about life is that one nation cannot talk about another nation's country. Only those traditional owners of those countries can talk about those countries, and therefore when you talk about like a state treaty or a national type treaty, it doesn't make sense in our culture.
So why do we need a whole bunch of treaties? What's the reason?
Because we need to move on. We've got to face the reality that there's 26 million other people in this country who have come here and helped build this country, and economic in other ways. And as a friend of mine, Mick Goody, used to say, if you're looking at sovereignty and other issues like that, then I hope you've got a good repatriation program, because there's about 26 million other people in this country. What are you going to do with them?
But what are treaties going to solve?
Well, I think it needs to resolve the issue of sovereignty. It needs to give certain, protection of Aboriginal culture and Aboriginal heritage on these lands, and we're moving very strongly in that position with the Land Rights Acts and the Native Title Acts, where Aboriginal people have a major say what happens on their land. Through that process, 55% of Australia now is in Aboriginal ownership. We'll probably get up to 70 or 80%, I predict, in the next 10 to 20 years. But we need to resolve these issues and stop these fights.
And do you think those treaties are more likely to happen if people vote yes or vote no on October 14?
Look, I have serious problems if it's a yes vote, because these people are looking at, putting on top of the First Nation native title and land rights stuff another body of bureaucracy. We don't need another body of bureaucracy. We need to recognise those traditional owners. So
we're more likely to get treaties if people vote no?
Yeah, because then we have to do the hard. On the 15th of October, if it's a no vote, that's when the real work starts. About, as Jacinta said, the senator, she said we've got to have accountability. We're spending billions of dollars every year, and according to the Closing the Gap, we're still not going places. So we've got to deal with that.
So your message is vote no, and the treaties process will really begin.
Yeah, and also the real things about accountability in education, in jobs, and that needs to be done. Now, if we can do just three things: accountability, jobs, and education, then we'll resolve most of the problems we got.
Let's just talk about the arguments for and against the Voice. Australia's had various Indigenous advisory bodies over the years. You led one of them for several years. This was the Indigenous Advisory Council. 12 members handpicked by the Prime Minister of the day, all taxpayer funded, all able to provide advice on matters relating to Indigenous Australians. Was that a successful model?
Yeah, well, I don't know about being successful. What we did was achieve things. It was some people, we get confused about it. We're not a representative body. We had black and white on that council. We had experts in different areas, from business to community groups and etc. And that's what it was. It was to be advising the Prime Minister's office and cabinet in ways that we could improve things. And the biggest thing we got out of it was the Indigenous business strategy, which is now worth $8.7 billion, and it cost the government virtually nothing to set up.
And that advisory body wasn't an unnecessary layer of bureaucracy full of elites?
No, we didn't have a bureaucracy. We were just a committee, and what we did was advise, and so we were given certain projects to look at, and we did that. We saw the forest review in regard to employment and business. We've seen a whole wide range of that. In fact, those committees exist for every minister today, and they have been existing for ministers for quite a while.
So why can't the Voice do something like that?
Well, the difference between us and the Voice, as I said, we weren't a representative body. We weren't. We were made up of all different races.
Yeah,
and we were experts in these areas of what needed to be done. The Voice, and also we weren't in the Constitution. We were totally outside that, and this is one of the problems I had, and this is one of the problems why I stepped away from the Uphold and Recognise movement, was because I didn't see why did we have to have it in the Constitution, because that creates a position that Aboriginals are always going to need help and always are always victims, and I didn't agree with that.
So what do you want to see in the Constitution? We know Peter Dutton's talking about a second referendum if this one goes down, that there's symbolic recognition. You've put up your own idea of also recognising migrants and refugees. Is that still your view?
Well, look, I think that, that everyone who's come to this country, First People and everyone else, has contributed to this country and made it the great liberal democracy and economic powerhouse that we are today. And I think people need to be, recognised for that. The problem with having just recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in the Constitution as First People, 90% of Australians want that to happen. But the problem is there's going to be another battle within the Aboriginal community about that.
So you're saying recognise everybody in the Constitution?
Yeah, well, in a sense we are, because if you're a citizen of this country, you are recognised in the Constitution. And so Aboriginal people are there now today, but it doesn't say specifically about that. Now, look, to me, I think this whole thing's been hijacked in that what couple of good things have come out of this. One is the Australian public want Aboriginal to be recognised, and two, that they want practical outcomes. They're sick and tired of getting the annual Closing the Gap report and the Productivity Commission report, and things are not working in a lot of areas.
What's just symbolic recognition going to deliver in terms of practical outcomes?
Well, I wouldn't underestimate symbolism. You know, when I sat in the Parliament that day, that the sorry debate, the leader of the Prime Minister got up and led it, and the leader of the opposition seconded it. To me, that was a very powerful day, because for the first time we really recognised what happened to the stolen generation, and a government of Australia apologised for that. And so I'll be honest, I had a tear in my eye. I thought about all those people who had suffered in the past and some people who are still suffering today. And I thought that was a very good healing process. The issue now is we need practical stuff, real stuff that's going to make the difference.
I want to ask you about racism, which has been a bit of a feature this past week. Look, you recently accused the Prime Minister of unleashing horrible racist abuse, and you've spoken about the toll it's taken on you during this campaign. Linda Burney's also spoken about the appalling racist abuse she's copped. Has the level of racism brought up in this debate surprised you at all?
Unfortunately, no. The intensity of it, yes. In the last 12 months, I've never seen so much racism and comments and attacks than I've seen since I was a kid. It's dreadful, and the reason I raised it about the Prime Minister is that if the Prime Minister was going to bring this a referendum forward, and he's talking about uniting the people, he shouldn't have used derogatory terms against people who didn't agree with him, because
Like what?
that was, well, he was calling people Chicken Little, and people, all of us was out of touch, and we were mean.
So if you
and
say
all
someone's out of touch, is that racist?
I didn't say it was racist.
Oh.
I said what he did was that he opened the door for other people to come and make comments.
Okay. Have you had to kick any more people off your campaign for racist remarks?
Oh, look, I've been very strong about these issues. People know that, and you notice that some people aren't talking anymore.
Like Gary Johns.
Yeah. So
why is that?
Well, because we had a cup of tea and we talked about it.
What did you say?
My thing is that I talk to everyone, racist, non-racist, and everyone. Because if we're going to eliminate racism or try to eliminate racism, then you've got to talk to racists. You've got to talk to everyone.
You said to him, "You've really got to stop talking."
Well, it's a team effect. We need to sit down and talk about everyone. And talk to everyone, and I'm going to talk to every Australian and talk to and convince them about our argument about not being racist.
Was Gary Johns being racist in some of his remarks?
Look, I think he had an opinion, and I don't agree with all of his opinion, but the problem we have is that once you start talking about race, it never ends well. And we've seen that on both sides of the aisle, and it's been pretty dreadful. So we've got to stop talking about race and actually get back to the referendum and start talking about those issues.
Finally, Warren Mundine, are you keen to replace Maurice Payne in the Senate as a Liberal senator?
I'm focusing on a couple of things at the moment, and I've just come back from a day's break with my family, and that is that number one. Number two is
have a chat about becoming a senator with the family.
I haven't had a chat with anyone about this because I'm not focused. I'm not focused on anything.
So not with Peter Dutton?
Too irrelevant. I have not had a conversation with Peter. I have never had a conversation with anyone. To me, that's irrelevant. To me, the Senate campaign, who's going to replace Maurice Payne, my thing is about we need to focus on defeating the Voice.
Well, Scott Morrison reckons you'd be a good replacement for Maurice Payne. Does his endorsement help?
Well, I hadn't noticed any of that stuff because I've been too busy.
All right. Warren Mundine, appreciate you joining us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, let's bring in our panel. We're joined this week by Bridget Brennan, Clare Armstrong, and a very warm welcome to the couch, James Massola. Good to have you here. Look, just a little bit to explore from that interview. Where to begin? Bridget, let's just come back to the idea that there's no ongoing negative impacts of colonisation, the argument from Jacinta dumping at the price at the press club. Warren Mundine, I think it's fair to say, a little more nuanced. He has certainly argued in the past that there are ongoing impacts, but he really wants to move forward. Peter Dutton wouldn't back in exactly what Jacinta Price said, but defended her right to say it. What is the view on this rather large issue in Indigenous communities in particular?
Well, one of the great privileges of my life as an Aboriginal person and as an Indigenous affairs reporter is going to sit down with Stolen Generations survivors. It's an absolute privilege that I wish all Australians could have the chance to do, because these are some of the most courageous, resilient, decent Australians we have in this country. Go and tell them that colonisation hasn't affected their lives. Go and tell Aboriginal people like me who had a parent who died 20 years before they should. I mean, this is a fringe view. It should be treated as such. I've noted a lot of people commenting about the different reports that you can go and look at that explores this issue. I thought we'd settled this as a country. We apologised a long time ago to the Stolen Generations survivors, and we have explored this. We've settled this. I just think that in the main, Aboriginal people know that colonisation continues to affect our lives. Now, of course, for some people, transgenerational trauma is not as damaging as it is for other people in our community, but it also doesn't help us to close the gap. Having this issue debated, it's a distraction from getting out there and lifting the standards, the living standards for our First Peoples.
Yeah, well, you mentioned those reports. I went back and had a look at some of them yesterday. Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, the stats are pretty clear. Members of the stolen generation and their children, so the next generation, much higher rates of poor outcomes on health and education, incarceration and so on. And you're right to
I'll just say, it's a shame on our nation that stolen generation survivors are still living deep, deep below the poverty line. I mean, I just think we really have to explore this as a media community, as an Australian community. We need to really be quite sensitive about the way we talk about this, because this is about people's very real lives.
Well, I want to just play a little more of what Jacinta Price did say about, well, she compared the intergenerational trauma of Indigenous Australians to that of the descendants of convicts.
Would you accept that there have been generations of trauma as a result of that history?
Well, I guess that would mean that those of us whose ancestors were dispossessed of their own country and brought here in chains as convicts are also suffering from intergenerational trauma. So I should be doubly suffering from intergenerational trauma.
Now, the cheering, I should point out, not the journalists, but the National Party front bench that were there in the room in the front row. There was Bridget McKenzie, Barnaby Joyce, Michaeli Cash from the Liberals, David Littleproud. They loved that sort of argument, Claire. But is that the sort of thing they can't necessarily say out loud themselves?
Certainly a few of them were then asked if they agreed with Jacinta's position in the days after that National Press Club address, and they carefully danced around going there, often, you know, respecting her contribution as an Indigenous Australian to the debate. But as you can see from their reaction in the room, it was a pretty hearty endorsement. I think where it's interesting hearing Warren there as well and Jacinta actually differ from maybe that conservative viewpoint that the Nationals were clapping along to is Jacinta and Warren see this as if you tell and label Indigenous people as victims, they will be trapped in that narrative forever. They will never be able to get out themselves. Perhaps other people in Jacinta's party room see that as it's used as an excuse to never try and get out of that situation. So I think there's actually even nuance between the issue that they all sort of agree on.
Look, I think Warren Mundine's position there, James, was on this issue was, you know, not denying necessarily that intergenerational impact, but as Claire says, not being trapped by it. He kept saying we've got to move forward, is the argument.
Yeah, look, that's right. I would take issue with one of the points that Warren made, David, about, you know, he said, look at, you know, Marcia Langton, look at Noel Pearson, look at me. We've had advantages. It's not
success stories, yeah.
Exactly. And of course, there are Indigenous success stories in this country. But to Bridget's point about the poverty line, you know, there was someone made the point this week in a piece. The poverty line in Australia is something like $489 a week, and something like 1 in 2 Indigenous Australians live on about $500 a week. That's right on the poverty line. So yes, there are success stories, but there are a much larger number of people who aren't living that success.
Just on Warren Mundine, treaties, which we know he's long supported, treaties. He's arguing this morning, Claire, that if people vote no, there will be a greater chance of treaties.
This is something that I find so astonishing in a lot of what Warren has been saying, where half the time he seems to be making the case for yes, because obviously the whole point of the Uluru Statement from the Heart was talking about creating a body like the Voice to engage with federal government on the issue of treaties. And to be honest, that interview is a pretty clear splitting of the no case, because a huge part of the argument that the no case have been mounting over the last few months is watch out for the Voice, it'll lead to treaty.
And he's talking, when he talks about treaties, Bridget, about sovereignty. He kept saying this is about sovereignty. That's an interesting word to explore for those on the no side.
Well, you look at Warren's comments over many, many years. He has, as Claire said, been a supporter of treaties for decades. And it's something he said after, I remember interviewing him after the Uluru Statement came out, and he was talking about we actually have to deal as Indigenous nations with states and with nation-to-nation kind of treaties. This has been his long-held view for a long time. And what is actually interesting to me is that we sometimes forget that there's a progressive no case being run largely in the Aboriginal community. I mean, the bulk of Aboriginal people who'll be voting no come October 14, from what I can tell when I have conversations with a large amount of people in the Aboriginal community, is because they want to see treaty first. So it's interesting that although he's aligned for the conservative no case, that progressive no case, that completely aligns with their view that treaty should be preferenced over a voice process.
Yeah, just on that treaty process, or treaties process, David, Professor Anne Toomey, one of the most eminent legal scholars in this country, an interview I had with her this week, said she made a couple of points. First of all, the treaties process is already underway at a state level, at multiple states. In fact, I think New South Wales might be the only state that's not doing it. Secondly...
They've got a Minister for Treaties, so...
Oh, forgive me, there we go. The process is happening regardless, and will continue to happen regardless of whether there's a voice to Parliament or not. So that idea that, you know, stop the voice and you stop treaty happening, it's a furphy.
Look, Marcia Langton's comments, I want to come to that because the opposition were all over the comments that Professor Marcia Langton made at an event in Bunbury in WA, where she basically argued that the case being put by the No campaign is built on racism.
Every time the No case raises one of their arguments, if you start pulling it apart, you get down to base racism. I'm sorry to say it, but that's where it lands. Or just sheer stupidity.
Now, she was initially misquoted as suggesting that no voters are racist. The Australian newspaper changed that headline. Peter Dutton's social media post, here it is still there, in which it, well, incorrectly says that she's having a go at no voters. She did point out her comments were about the campaign, not the no voters, but then separate comments from Marcia Langton emerged in which, well, a few things. She suggested that about 20% of the no voters are spewing racism. There were other remarks about racism as well. Claire, how awkward did that make the week in Parliament for the government?
It pretty much derailed any chance of the government using the last sitting week before the vote to have a serious crack at reaching the Australian people about what the Voice is trying to do and what it's about. In election campaigns, and a referendum is not dissimilar, discipline is really important, and unfortunately you have incidences like this and it just derails the case.
So why is that?
Not to detract from Marcia's points, but the reality of it is you get punished in politics for going off message.
Yeah, and for going after the people you're trying to win over and criticising them. And so every minister who was asked about this, no, we're not, you know, using this racism line against the other side. James, how unhelpful do you think it was for the government?
A couple of thoughts there, David. First of all, I think it's pretty unextraordinary for Marcia Langton to actually call out racism where she saw it. And Warren Mundine just touched on this too. The campaign has driven racism to the surface. So in that sense, you know, good on her for doing it. But in terms of the political effect of this, I agree with Claire. It was very damaging for the government this week. Yeah,
and look, there's no denying the lived experience of Marcia Langton. That, you know, I certainly can't judge here, but she's obviously not a campaigner either, and you can see all the politicians being a lot more cautious in this. Bridge, is it clear what evidence there is of the campaign from the No side basing arguments in racism? What's she referring to there?
So she was referring to the imputation that Aboriginal people are lazy, that they can't get jobs, that they've got too much power, that they don't deserve any more power. I mean, we know those assumptions have been in the Australian community for decades, right? And this just all felt very 1990s to me. Feels like we're back in the native title days. You know, the Aborigines are going to take your backyard. What are we going to do if we give them too much power? What are they going to do, you know? So we know as Aboriginal people, we can see it online, that there is a torrent of that online. Now, that may not come as official, you know, that's not officially endorsed by the No campaign, but those who are voting No, from what I can see online, where a lot of Australians live, this is where the debate is happening, on Instagram, on TikTok, on Facebook. There is a barrage of racism online, and that's what it is. It's that kind of vintage racism that Aboriginal people know exists, but the general Australian population aren't exposed to.
And one of the No campaign leaders, Gary Johns, who we heard Warren Mundine refer to.
Did he get fired on national television just then?
Quite possibly.
Definitely banned.
So some of his comments have included that Indigenous Australians in remote communities are living in stupor. He says if they want a voice, they should learn to speak English. Obviously, after those comments, what did Warren say? That he had a cup of tea with Gary Johns and we haven't heard from him again.
Yeah, I think what's important here, and it's been raised a few times this week, is that the outrage around an Indigenous person calling out their lived experience and what they see of racism has far outweighed the outrage in response to actual racist comments, which is just abhorrent and goes to the issues that Marcia was trying to raise in the first place.
The next 4 weeks, Parliament's not sitting, so the campaigns are out in the community. There are marches happening today, concerts and so on for the Yes side. What are we likely to see? Does anyone have any thoughts on how things are going and how confident, I suppose, the yes side is, given how far back they are in the polls? James.
So I'm talking to the yes camp over the last couple of days. They say they've got about $20 million to spend in the next 4 weeks on advertising. A bit of context, major parties spend about $30 million each, $35 million each on advertising during elections. So it's a decent sum of money. They reckon they've got about 40,000 volunteers, about 30,000 of whom will be handing out how to votes on the day, and that gives them a tactical advantage over the No campaign on the day. Whether there is enough time, whether that is enough money to draw this back in, to at least make it close, remains.
And there's the big question of whether the message is clear enough. This has been one of the problems, Bridge.
Absolutely. Someone I spoke to in the Yes Camp said about a quarter of the people they're speaking to, A, don't know there's a referendum happening, which is huge, or B, just don't know what it's about, have no idea, are very confused by the process. So that's a large section of the community they've got to get out to. I think there has been some disquiet in the Yes campaign about coordination, particularly going out to those outer suburbs. I mean, this has been a campaign that's been very grassroots. It's been telling communities to run this how they see fit. But I think there is now a view that this needs to be a lot more coordinated if they're going to win over that big section.
And I would add to that, there's also now a role for the government to play. They've proven pretty incompetent over the last 6 months in answering some pretty basic questions, not of detail, but of explaining to Australians principally what's going on here. You know, the fact that they hemorrhage during question time over questions like how will you get gender parity on The Voice? Well, if every co-ed high school in history has managed to elect a boy and a girl school captain, like, I'm pretty sure it's possible. But they just seem so incapable of formulating easy responses to questions that would just go to allaying the fears in the community.
Just on Bridget's point about messaging and coordination and what have you, David Crowe and Karen Barlow have both written, you know, about this academic research that's been out in the last week or so. Something like 33 different key messages online from the Yes campaign. No has two people essentially out there, Jacinta Price, Warren Mundine, and their message is much simpler, and that's why it's cutting through.
Let's move on to housing. After a very long standoff between Labor and the Greens over the Housing Australia Future Fund, this signature Labor election promise, a $10 billion fund, they finally struck a deal during the week and the legislation passed through Parliament. I understand the Prime Minister and the Greens leader spoke on the Monday morning while he was still on the plane coming back from the G20 in India. Then they caught up face to face. Deal done, it was announced. The Greens managed to score an extra $1 billion from the government for public housing, and they dropped their conditional demand for a rent freeze or rent cap. But the Greens say they'll keep fighting for that.
They saw the pain that renters are suffering and they decided to do nothing for them. Yeah, that makes me upset and angry. Now, if we get to the next election, and maybe this is what it's going to take, and Labor lose a bunch of new seats to the Greens because they ignored the 1/3 of this country who rents, then so be it.
Upset and angry, but voting for this bill. Why, Claire, ultimately did the Greens have to fold on this?
I think there's only so long you can stand in the way of, you know, what's now obviously going to be more than 30,000 social and affordable homes being built over the next 5 years. And they haven't got anywhere near what they were asking for in terms of a $5 billion a year spend and that movement on rents. But
they got something, though. They got something.
$3 billion, which, you know, is not bad for a first-term MP who no one knew the name of 12 months ago.
But nothing, not the rent freezes or rent caps that were so central to the whole fight here, James. Right? I think from the moment the National Cabinet leaders, state and territory leaders said, no, that's not going to help things. Yeah. It was pretty clear they had to be pragmatic, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It was difficult to sustain a policy argument against passing the HAF for the Greens. Now, Grattan Institute, who originally came up with this idea, they've said they think a $20 billion fund, even that may not keep pace with existing demand over the next 5 years. I think we will have to see further movement over the next 3 to 5 to increase the size of the HAF. And then the other sort of aspect to this, David, if you like, is the political aspect. Now, I'm not sure that Anthony Albanese has actually got the politics right here. Max Chandler-Mather is tapping into a rich vein of voters who can't afford to buy a house. You look at the Australian National University electoral survey after the last election, 37% of renters voted Labor, 26% voted Liberal, 24% voted Green. That is the seam that Chandler Mather is tapping.
Yeah, and look, the rent controls that he's talking about, clearly Labor doesn't think that's a good idea, but the Greens know the politics amongst renters runs very much in their favour here, Bridge, so the government's going to have to think of a way through this before the next election.
The Greens are happy to prosecute themselves as a party for renters, and they've been very successful. And I think they know that perhaps renters haven't read all the detail into whether or not a rent freeze is sustainable or not. They just know that people are in deep pain, and it could well win them more seats at the next election.
Yeah, well, yeah, maybe Labor will have to keep arguing the policy argument against that sort of rent control is only making their life worse for renters over time if they're going to stick to that position.
I think they did Labor, through the PM announcing after National Cabinet last month that they had this better deal for renters, which was really just a standardisation of a lot of renting conditions that already existed across most of the states. That was the first sign that there was an acknowledgement, I think, that politically this is going to be an issue for the Prime Minister.
On the veterans' suicides, we saw something unusual this week. Nick Caldis, who's one of the Royal Commissioners looking into veterans and military suicide, inquiry's still running. It doesn't finish until next year, but he spoke out very publicly, went to the National Press Club, really to put a rocket up Defence over this issue.
Defence's approach to investigating and reporting on suicides has progressed at a snail's pace. We are yet to find sufficient evidence of urgency in responding to these complex issues holistically, even with this Royal Commission on foot. All of this raises serious questions as to whether Defence is committed to making change in the best interests of its members, or whether they're just going through the motions.
Yeah, as I say, James, you don't see that too often while an inquiry is still underway. You really ripped into Defence there.
Yeah, and look, frankly, David, good on him. The culture in Defence in this country, in terms of accountability, scrutiny, is not great. Any working journalist will tell you if they've ever put in a media inquiry, it can take days to get an answer to a question as simple as, is the sky blue? So Caldis, I think, is coming from that place. Fair enough too.
It was good to see, though, the Chief of Defence, Angus Campbell, was there in the room to listen to all of that. The question is, Claire, will Defence actually do what he's suggesting and A, help the inquiry, and then B, set up the sort of things it's promised to set up much earlier, things like a mental health and wellbeing branch within Defence?
It would be a dramatic departure from history if that happened. A year ago, Caldis released his interim report from the Royal Commission in which he made the exact same plea, that he was struggling to do what he needed to do because of the lack of access and timely access to information from Defence and from the Commonwealth. And you had the Veterans Affairs Minister, Matt Keogh, respond to that. You had him in the room again, and I actually think it is abhorrent that you've had to have a Royal Commissioner come out 12 months after politely asking, can I please have access to this information that relates to the death of some 1,600 Australian Defence personnel since 1997.
And the stats, for those who aren't aware, they're pretty alarming for permanent members of Defence once they've left the force. I think that it's 44% more likely for men to take their own lives than the general community, more than 100% for women than the stats in the general community. So, I mean, the problem is clear. Do you think, Bridge, that sort of appearance from the Royal Commissioner, Nick Caldis, is going to, well, as I say, put a rocket up Defence and other agencies?
Aside from the need to appeal to those individuals in Defence who needed that message that you can't stall. If this is our gold standard of independently investigating systemic wrongs and failings in our institutions, then we need to accept that the Commissioner needs information immediately. I mean, I think one of the best points he made was in 2025, Defence will perhaps have set up a specialised mental health unit within Defence to respond to this crisis, and yet the department to respond to the Royal Commission, which he kind of hinted at is stalling, that was set up within hours, so clearly this can happen. But I think also what Nick Caldis did was speak to those people and those families who've been so tragically affected by this. So it wasn't just a call out to Defence, it was a call out to people who've lost dads and husbands and mothers and sisters to say we're listening and we're going to hear you. And
they all want to see something better than what's in place at the moment. Back on what was happening in Parliament, the government's other big bit of legislation, the Industrial Relations Bill that it wanted to get through before the end of the year now won't happen. The Senate's pushed that off until next year. And the crossbench in particular in the Senate, which are going to be critical on this, They want the bill split so that some of the more some of the measures that are likely to have support can be more urgently brought in.
This is so important. PTSD and domestic violence and things like that are so important to you. Then remove them out of the bill and we can get this done this year, and that can start on the 1st of January, not the 1st of July next year.
Yeah, James, what's Jackie Lambie talking about there? What elements does the crossbench want dealt with now?
Yeah, so this is the Closing Loopholes Bill. It runs to hundreds of pages. The non-controversial stuff Jackie's referring to is better access to care, to assistance for first responders who have PTSD. There's some other things in there on domestic violence, leave, small business insolvency, help for people who are ill from working with silica, with those engineered stone bench tops, that sort of thing. It's pretty straightforward.
So she's saying get that done this year?
Get it done, and then let's talk about the gig economy changes, which would put people who are in gig work or who are labour hire contractors, let's put that, and the idea is they would get the same pay as people who are direct employees. Let's put that off till next year. Let's have this Senate inquiry into that, but let's get the important stuff that everyone agrees on done now.
This isn't an unusual situation for a big government bill, right, where some of its opponents or some on the crossbench say, split the bill, we'll all pass the stuff we agree on and deal with the rest later. Problem is, for a government, the other part never happens if they do that, right? So,
well, this is a bit Groundhog Day because we had the same debate over the first tranche of the industrial relations changes that Labor brought in a year ago, where the non-controversial parts were really being pushed by the crossbench to get
even to go back a few years before that, the Morrison government's tax cuts. Remember stage 1, 2, 3, and let's split the bill and just put through the stage 1 and 2. They're never going to do it, are they?
No, because, I mean, to engage the crossbench on issues that they care about, they're being tied to issues that they may not otherwise support. That's politics, unfortunately.
Yeah, this is a setback, though, for the government right now, because these industrial relations changes, I mean, we spoke to Tony Burke on this program 2 weeks ago about it. They really believe vulnerable workers are being dudded, as you say, whether it's in the gig economy or labour hire, and they want to fix that, but who knows whether they'll succeed now.
Well, the irony is they took these second tranche of changes much more clearly to the election than you could argue they did. Multi-employer bargaining, which they passed 12 months ago, it was a decision by the government of which one to do first and which one to expend their political capital on, so they've made their bed.
They have. Look, a final one. A Senate inquiry delivered a unanimous report on Thursday, I think it was. This is about the way universities and colleges deal with sexual harassment and abuse complaints on campus, the sort of systems they have in place. It was scathing, this inquiry, and it demanded some urgent action. An independent task force be set up right now to really monitor how the tertiary sector is dealing with this. Bridget, the government's looking at options still. It's not moving as fast as it seems this inquiry reckons it should.
That's right, and it's a difficult issue because universities are historically pretty opaque institutions, and there hasn't been much rigour or even investigation into how complaints are being dealt with. And for a student who's going to a trusted university or a trusted institution who has no one to turn to, the government really needs to look at this quite quickly, because it's a massive issue for people at university right now. And, it's a global issue, and I just think if we don't step up on this, we could be at a Royal Commission in 10 years on this. That the scale of victims is enormous, and these are some of our youngest, most vulnerable Australians. And I think the government really shouldn't underestimate how much unease and distress there is in the young Australian community about this.
Yeah, and Claire, this committee included Liberal, Green and Labor senators.
Absolutely. There's the last time we got any sort of data, I guess you could say, about the rate of sexual assault in university campuses was in 2021. A national survey found that on average 275 students are sexually assaulted in university settings every week.
Every week?
Every week. And part of what this committee uncovered is that the government gave Universities Australia, the peak body representing these institutions, $1.5 million to develop a campaign to build respectful relationships and awareness of consent on campus. Put it this way, I've done a story about some of the marketing ideas that will come up for that campaign. They look like they've come from the set of the movie American Pie. They are unbelievably inappropriate, and you did not need to spend $1.5 million to figure out why they never made it out the door. Nothing actually public-facing in terms of an awareness campaign or assistance has been done since. It is absolutely appalling.
And you referenced that survey, because that was that year during a
During
COVID,
COVID,
it was during
year.
COVID year,
Not
right?
every school was not everyone was back on campus.
So where are we at in terms of a fresh survey that gives us more up-to-date, accurate statistics now that we're post-lockdowns as to how big the problem is? Is that survey going to happen?
It's a great question for Education Minister Jason Clare.
And the universities.
And the university, but it was never conducted by the universities, it was conducted by the Student Association. So I think this is, as Bridget has said, a real fork in the road moment for this sector. They can be proactive and deal with this now, or they will be dealing with the consequences for decades, just like the poor victims that they're ignoring are right now.
All right, we'll see. Jason Clare, the Education Minister, and I think the Attorney-General Mark Dreyfus have flagged that, yes, they're looking at this inquiry report. They've got meetings with their state and territory counterparts and the sector, and there's activity underway, but we'll see how urgent that all ends up being. Our panel, Clare Armstrong, James Massola and Bridget Brennan will be back shortly with some final observations. Time now, though, for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with cartoonist for the Herald Sun, the one and only Mark Knight, and a very warm welcome.
Great to see you in Melbourne, Mike.
The government's no longer a bunch of have-nots. They got their Housing Affordability Future Fund through Parliament this week, and I just love the look on Adam Band's face here. You've just drawn him as he sort of realised, oh, it's,
yes, houses are made of wood.
Adam, it's great that you and the Greens have agreed to pass my Housing Future Fund. Now can we get on with the building of the houses?
That's not wood they're using, is it? This is like Parliament's version of the block. I don't know how it's going to go.
I did love this, David Rowe, the halfway house. Oh, yes, Albo's talking to Adam Band here. You do know your friends can't park here. As Mr Dutton and Miss Littleproud are pulling in.
Pulled up in the 777.
Yep.
And don't you love the ScoMo logo? Yeah. The flying kangaroo is sullied now.
Nose art. It's just beautiful.
Yep, maybe ScoMo in a bikini in Hawaii.
The Hawaiian belle.
That's lovely. Look at the Greens carrying the red couch in here.
Yes. Lovely Fiona Katauskas. She's got, you might need to get a bigger too hard basket. We can't help with affordable rentals, but we have found somewhere to put you.
I love this cartoon because Australia is fascinated with big things, as you know, big banana, big koala. It's a natural fit for this country. We better get weaving.
Mark, to the polls, the Voice is having trouble reaching people's ears, it seems, and beautiful David Pope, who's got paper, scissors, rock as the yes hand is extended, and this looks like to be some sort of fist bump from COVID.
I like this. It is a beautiful drawing, and I think, you know, if we can't get a handshake, we go back to COVID days, or even just that. Can we do that?
Kathy Wilcock, Indigenous people don't need a special voice to Parliament because we are already equal.
Except when they speak out about inequity, then they're elite.
Yes.
That word, elite.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I like Kathy here. She's just discreetly in the background put the Aboriginal art, which I guess says something about this family and the way they're thinking.
Beautiful Kudelka, who's got Peter Dutton here, and he's seeding fear, uncertainty and doubt, and there's some sort of fanged tulips, I think.
Noxious weed.
Alan Joyce might have left Qantas, but he certainly left some baggage, and he left some big baggage in the High Court this week. Oh. And wasn't it good to see the government back on familiar ground, because they were like, oh, we can get on board with this. It's the unions fighting Qantas. This is familiar territory, right? Alex Ellinghausen was outside the High Court when they won their case against Qantas.
Sally McManus looks like she looks like a winner there.
Celebrations all round as they won. I did love this David Pope. He's got Alan Joyce. It wasn't sacking him. It was just extreme distancing. Never a waste of good crisis, as the permanent staff seemed to be falling off the back. Your Honour, we were still all in this together. We just added some social distancing.
That's a very scary bit of social distancing. As one part of the plane goes to Sydney and the other goes to Melbourne. That's a lovely description.
The long and winding road came to an end for Michael Long this week as he reached Parliament. I spent a couple of days with him. What a lovely, gracious human being he is.
Such a gentle man.
Yeah, it was some lovely images. A whole heap of politicians joined them across the lake for their final walk walk up to Parliament, and Bridget Archer and Julian Lesser from Liberals for Yes here on the side.
Albo's got his hoodie on.
There was a beautiful moment where he took Michael's hand, and it was a rare moment. Mark,
Yeah, it was. I think it's one of the great symbols is the two hands joining.
Mark, the force is strong with this one. I'll let you do the honours.
Thanks, Mike. And when in doubt, vote Kenobi. Back to you, Spearsy.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Claire, starting with you.
Well, there's obviously been a bit of talk about second referendums, depending on the Voice result. One thing that gets argued against the Voice is that if you have this permanent body that manages to close the gap, what do we do then? We have a body in the Constitution that maybe hasn't served its purpose. Well, even if there are no other issues to deal with Indigenous Australians, wouldn't it be a great day sending Australians to the polls for a referendum to revoke the Voice to Parliament because the gap had been closed?
James.
Recent ABS data that came out, David, shows that our investment in scientific research and development has been going backwards for 14 years. It's something like 1.74%, almost half of what the OECD average is. An investment in science is an investment in productivity. Now, Ed Husick is fighting the good fight around the cabinet table. I'd like to see a bit more buy-in from some of his colleagues, because greater productivity means greater incomes for all Australians, basically. And one quick second point, if I may, a thank you to all the staff at the Indepth Hospital who've been looking after my mum Rose so well this week, and who's on the improve.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you. Bridge.
Oh, best wishes to Rose. Tonight on ABC, we've got a new program called Voices of Australia. It's hosted by the wonderful Isabel Higgins. I'm a little bit biased because I'm in the show for the second episode. And it's an Indigenous-led show that really explains to Australians what's going on. If you're confused about treaties, the Constitution, sovereignty, it really unpacks that in a simple Indigenous-led way. So we're really proud of it. 6:30 tonight on iView.
Oh, great. Great idea. I'll be tuning in for sure. Look, thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Well, after a torrid week in Parliament, we thought we'd leave you with something a bit gentler. The annual visit to Parliament from the Vision Australia puppy dogs. Thanks for watching.
I'll get the kiss now. Hey? He's very sweet, this one.
Yeah. You got a friend in me. When the road looks rough ahead and you're miles and miles from your nice warm bed, you just remember what your old past said. Boy, you got a friend in me. You got a friend in me.
But they require a lot of walking and exercise.